Johnny Carson was in the middle of his monologue when he noticed something that made him stop mid-sentence. In the third row sat a woman crying. Not laughing, crying. What he did next would become the most talked about moment in Tonight Show history. It was October 3, 1984 at Studio 6B in Burbank, California. The Tonight Show was in full swing, and Johnny was delivering his trademark monologue to a packed audience of 300 people. He'd already gotten huge laughs with jokes about the presidential election and a bit about his recent golf game. The energy in the room was electric. The way it always was when Johnny was on fire. But something was wrong in row 3. Margaret Sullivan sat perfectly still while everyone around her roared with laughter. Tears were streaming down her face. And she wasn't even trying to hide them. She was wearing a black dress and clutching a tissue in her hand, staring at Johnny Carson like he was the only person in the world. Johnny had been doing this show for 22 years. He performed in front of thousands of audiences, told tens of thousands of jokes, and he could read a crowd better than anyone in television. And right now, his instincts were telling him something was very, very wrong with the woman in the black dress. Margaret Sullivan hadn't want to come to the show that night. In fact, she'd spent most of the day trying to give away her tickets, but her daughter had insisted, saying it's what Dad would have wanted. Margaret's husband, Robert Sullivan, had died that morning at 6:47 a.m. after a sudden heart attack. He was 63 years old. Robert had been watching The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson every night for over 2 decades. It was his ritual, his way of ending each day. Even during his final hospital stay 2 years earlier when he'd had his first heart scare, Robert had insisted the nurses let him watch Johnny. "If I'm going out," he joked, "I want Johnny's voice to be the last thing I hear." The tickets for tonight's show had arrived 3 weeks ago. Robert had requested them months in advance, and when they finally came to mail, he'd been as excited as a kid on Christmas morning. He'd marked the date on the calendar, told everyone at work, even bought a new shirt specifically for the occasion, but Robert never made it to the show. At 6:47 that morning, while making coffee and humming the Tonight Show theme song, his heart simply stopped. Margaret's daughter, Linda, had found the tickets on her father's dresser that afternoon while helping her mother with funeral arrangements. "Mom," Linda had said, holding up the tickets with tears in her eyes. "We have to go. Dad would have wanted us to go." Margaret had protested. How could she sit in an audience and laugh when her husband of 38 years was dead? How could she watch Johnny Carson crack jokes when her whole world had just collapsed? But Linda had been insistent. Dad lived for the show. He would have wanted someone to use those tickets. He would have wanted us to go and laugh for him since he can't. So Margaret had put on her black dress, the same one she'd been wearing at the hospital that morning, and she'd come to Studio 6B. She'd sat down in row 3, center section, the exact seats Robert had requested when he filled out the ticket application. And now, as Johnny Carson told jokes and the audience laughed, Margaret couldn't stop crying. Johnny finished his current joke, got his laugh, and prepared to move into his next bit, but he couldn't concentrate. His eyes kept drifting back to the woman in row 3. In 22 years of hosting this show, he'd seen plenty of people not laugh at his jokes, but he'd never seen someone sit in his audience and cry with such obvious heartbreak. He started his next joke, but halfway through he stopped. The words just wouldn't come. He looked down at his cue cards, then back up at the woman. The audience, sensing something unusual was happening, began to quiet down. Johnny put down his cue cards and took a step forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice unusually serious. "I need to do something I've never done before." The audience went completely silent. Ed McMahon, sitting at his desk off to the side, looked confused. The cameramen weren't sure where to point their cameras. Johnny walked to the edge of the stage and pointed toward row 3. He said gently. "The woman in the black dress. Are you all right?" 300 people turned to look at Margaret Sullivan. The hot studio lights suddenly found her, and she was visible on the monitors throughout the building. Backstage producers were frantically trying to figure out what was happening. Margaret looked up at Johnny, tears still streaming down her face, and shook her head. "No," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "I'm not all right." What Johnny Carson did next shocked everyone in that studio, everyone watching on television, and eventually everyone who heard about it. He walked down the steps at the side of the stage and into the audience. In 22 years of hosting The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson had never left the stage during a broadcast except during commercial breaks. Never. The show had a format, a structure, a way things were done. And walking into the audience during a taping was not part of that format. But Johnny wasn't thinking about format or structure or ratings or what his producers would say. He was thinking about a woman who was crying in his audience. And he was thinking about the fact that something was terribly, terribly wrong. He made his way down the aisle toward row 3 as the audience watched in stunned silence. When he reached Margaret's row, the people sitting next to her moved aside to let him through. Johnny knelt down in the aisle next to Margaret's seat. The cameras, now realizing this was a moment worth capturing, zoomed in on the two of them. "What's your name?" Johnny asked softly. "Margaret," she managed to say through her tears. "Margaret Sullivan." "Margaret," Johnny said, his voice gentle. "Why are you here tonight?" And that's when Margaret broke down completely. "My husband died this morning," she sobbed. "These were his tickets. He loved you so much. He watched you every single night for 22 years. He was so excited about coming here tonight. And now he's gone and I'm here. And I don't know why I came, but my daughter said he would have wanted us to use the tickets." And she couldn't continue. The weight of the day, the grief, the surreal experience of sitting in the Tonight Show audience while her husband lay dead. It all came crashing down on her at once. Johnny didn't say anything for a moment. He just stayed there, kneeling in the aisle, letting Margaret cry. Then he did something that no one expected. He reached out and took her hand. "What was your husband's name?" he asked. "Robert," Margaret whispered. "Robert Sullivan." Johnny nodded slowly. Then he looked up at the camera and spoke not to his audience, but to America. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Margaret Sullivan. Her husband, Robert, passed away this morning. Robert was a fan of this show, and these were his tickets. Margaret came here tonight because she thought it's what Robert would have wanted." He paused, his own voice starting to crack. "I've been doing this show for 22 years. I tell jokes. I interview celebrities. I try to make people laugh before they go to bed. But you know what? None of that matters compared to what Margaret is going through right now. None of it." The studio was so quiet you could hear the cameras humming. Johnny turned back to Margaret. "Would you like to tell me about Robert?" he asked. And so, in the middle of a Tonight Show taping with cameras rolling and 300 people watching in silence, Margaret Sullivan told Johnny Carson about her husband. She told him about how Robert would rush home from work every night to make sure he didn't miss the monologue. She told him about how Robert could quote Johnny's jokes for word the next day. She told him about how during Robert's hospital stay 2 years ago, watching Johnny had been the only thing that made him smile. "He said you were like a friend," Margaret said, wiping her eyes. "Every night it was like having a friend visit. He loved you, Johnny. He really did." Johnny Carson, the man who maintained perfect composure through thousands of shows, who'd handled every situation with wit and charm, who never let his emotions show on camera, started to cry. "Margaret," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never met Robert, but I want you to know something. When I sit behind that desk every night and tell jokes and talk to guests, I always imagine I'm talking to one person. Just one person sitting at home who needs a laugh, who needs a break from their day, who needs a friend. Robert was that person for me. He was exactly who I was talking to all these years." Margaret squeezed Johnny's hand. "He would have loved hearing that," she said. Johnny stood up slowly. He looked at the audience, then at the cameras, then back at Margaret. "Margaret," he said, "I'm going to finish this show, but I want you to know something tonight. Every joke I tell, every laugh I get, every moment of the show is for Robert. This whole show is for your husband." The audience erupted in applause, but it wasn't the usual excited applause. It was respectful, emotional, the kind of applause that acknowledges something sacred has just happened. Johnny walked back to the stage, wiping his eyes as he went. When he reached his desk, he picked up his cue cards, looked at them, and tossed them aside. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the camera, his voice still emotional. "We're going to continue with the show, but I want to dedicate tonight's program to Robert Sullivan, who never miss an episode. Robert, wherever you are, this one's for you. What happened next was unlike any Tonight Show episode before or since. Johnny continued with his show, but something had fundamentally changed. Every joke seemed more meaningful. Every moment felt more genuine. The celebrity guests that night, including Tom Selleck and Bette Midler, had been told what happened during the commercial break, and both of them mentioned Robert during their segments. To Robert Sullivan, Tom Selleck said, raising his coffee mug during his interview. The audience applauded. When Bette Midler performed her song at the end of the show, she looked directly at Margaret in the audience and dedicated her performance to Robert's memory. Throughout the show, cameras would occasionally cut to Margaret in the audience. She wasn't crying anymore. She was smiling. Not a big smile, not a happy smile, but a peaceful smile. The smile of someone who'd been given an unexpected gift in the middle of unimaginable grief. After the show ended and studio lights came up, Johnny Carson did something else he'd never done before. Instead of heading straight to his dressing room, as he always did, he walked back into the audience to find Margaret. "Can I have a moment with you?" he asked. Margaret followed Johnny backstage to his dressing room. Her daughter, Linda, who'd been sitting next to her, came too. For 15 minutes, Johnny talked with him about Robert, about loss, about life. He shared stories about his own father who passed away several years earlier. He talked about how grief never really goes away, but it changes. It softens. Before Margaret left, Johnny gave her something. It was a photograph of himself inscribed with a message to Robert Sullivan, who was there every night, and a Margaret who loved him with deepest sympathy and respect. Johnny Carson. Margaret clutched the photograph to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for stopping the show. Thank you for caring." Margaret. Johnny said, his hand on her shoulder. "Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for trusting me with Robert's memory, and thank you for reminding me why I do this show." The episode aired the next night, and within hours it became the most talked about Tonight Show in years. The switchboard at NBC was flooded with calls. Newspapers ran stories about it. People who've been watching at home called their friends and family to tell them what they'd witnessed. But the story didn't end there. It never does when something truly meaningful happens. In the weeks and months that followed, Johnny Carson became different. Crew members noticed it. Regular viewers noticed it. He seemed more present, more engaged, more aware of his audience as individuals rather than as a collective mass. He started paying closer attention during audience warm-ups. He asked his producers to look out for people in the audience who seemed troubled or upset that night with Margaret change. Ed McMahon said years later, Johnny realized that his show meant more people than just entertainment. It was companion, a friend, a presence in people's lives, and he took that responsibility seriously. After that, Margaret Sullivan continued to watch The Tonight Show every night, just as Robert had. She wrote to Johnny several times over the years, updating him on her life, her grief, her healing. Johnny wrote back every time, personal letters in his own handwriting. When Johnny Carson retired from The Tonight Show in 1992, Margaret was in the audience for his final episode. Johnny spotted her before the show started and had her brought backstage. They embraced like old friends. "Thank you for that night," Johnny told her. "Thank you for teaching me what this show really means. Thank you for seeing me when I needed to be seen," Margaret replied. The story of Johnny Carson and Margaret Sullivan reminds us that sometimes the most powerful moments in television, in life, happen when we stop performing and start connecting. When we stop following the script and start responding to what's real. Johnny could have ignored Margaret that night. He could have continued with his monologue, finished a show and gone home. After all, he had a format to follow, a show to produce, millions of viewers expecting their usual dose of entertainment. But instead, he chose humanity over format. He chose connection over convention. He chose to be Johnny the person instead of Johnny the performer. And in doing so, he gave a grieving widow a moment of grace. Taught 300 audience members what compassion looks like, showed millions of viewers that fame doesn't have to mean distance, and reminded all of us that the most important thing we can do for another person is simply see them in their pain and care. Today, There's a small mention the Museum of Broadcasting in New York about the October 3, 1984 episode of The Tonight Show. It's not celebrated for its ratings or its celebrity guests. It's remembered as a night Johnny Carson stopped being a talk show host and became exactly what Robert Sullivan had always seen him as, a friend. The greatest performance of Johnny Carson's career wasn't a joke or an interview or comedic bit. It was the moment he stepped off his stage, walked into his audience, and held the hand of a woman who needed to know that her husband's life mattered, that his death mattered, and that in the middle of her grief, she wasn't alone. If this story of compassion and human connection moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that kindness still exists in this world. Let us know in the comments about a time when someone stopped everything to help you in your moment of need. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories about the people behind the personas.